All right, hey everybody. Today we're going to start talking about the family. And the family is one of those things that I think, um, so you've heard me say in class before that one of the important things about sociology is that we have to take things that everybody thinks that they understand and find ways to tear it apart and dissect it and try to figure out what it really means. And so before we can talk about the family and delinquency, we really have to understand what the family itself is. Because in reality, the family is something that's a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface. If you've never thought about sociology of family before, my suspicion is that you probably think the family is this really universal experience for people, that everybody lives with their biological parents, that some people might have a couple of siblings. You probably have like a very middle class, arguably, possibly very white idea of what the family is. And in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. So we know that just like any other social institution, the idea of the family is heavily influenced by everything else that's happening in the world. And so we're kind of making a faulty assumption from the get-go, right? That the family is this thing that is universal and that the family is this thing that can't possibly be affected by anything else. We also, in the United States especially, have this long history of thinking about the family in terms of like tradition and traditional family values especially. And the reality is that there is no such thing as a traditional American family. So whatever family background you come from, like whatever your family looks like, is valid, because this idea of the traditional American family just is really a myth. And it draws from a short period of time after the Second World War, where this like nuclear two biological parent family kind of thrived very briefly. But that's really the only time in American history that's been the family. So in a way, we have like cherry picked from a brief period in our own history, a kind of like an outlier, almost like a random phenomenon that hadn't happened before or since, and we've held that up to as the ideal, and it's just not really a thing. We also have to think about how the family has changed with regard to other factors happening in the world. So before the Industrial Revolution, obviously the economy in the United States was more agrarian, right? So it's based more on farming. And if you're going to be successful in that type of economy, you had to have a really large family. So back then you would see people having up 10 or more kids, really. There were women who were pregnant really the entire time that physiologically they could be pregnant. Your children were cheap or free labor on your farm. And on top of that, I mean, healthcare was what it is now. It wasn't what it is now. So there's a higher infant mortality rate. And there's just the expectation that a lot of couples had that they needed to have a lot of kids because they knew that more than one of them probably wouldn't survive into adulthood. And that also has major economic implications for how the family farm is going to run. So we also have to think about this in terms of population densities. So if we were in class face to face, I would throw my left arm out and my right arm out to my side and say that back when you would have neighbors maybe 20 miles this way and 20 miles this other way. And really for many people, the only people that they interacted with regularly were their family. And you would see family farms not just being like mom and dad and the kids, but mom and dad and grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, all living and working on the same plot of land, right? There might be a small town nearby that you can go to depending on what you need. There might be a school and a church there, but that's not necessarily guaranteed. So what ends up happening is that the way that we even think about how the family grows and expands changes based on that population density. We also have these babies in cages. So back then, when the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a huge fear among ordinary people in society that cities were bad for kids. Not because cities were heavily polluted or because they were really dangerous, but the commonly held belief was that children growing up in the city were going to be deprived of sunlight, and that would somehow inhibit their growth. So there was a whole market for these sort of pens or crates, I guess you could call them today, suspended from your apartment window, where you could sit your baby outside and get the baby some sunlight, and that way their natural growth works out the way that it's supposed to. To get back to this point, though, this is where we still see laws on the books that defend marriage between first cousins. Because, again, your dating options and your romantic options are very limited. And so the family has to continue to grow and expand, and somebody's got to keep working that farm. And so this is why marriage between first cousins was legal, and for whatever reason is still legal in a few places today that you might find surprising, especially in the Northeast. So here we've got another small baby, probably about, 6-8 months old, hanging out outside his window with mom looking on, or a caretaker looking on. Baby's getting all that sunlight that they need to thrive. So I just talked about this part, right? The population density and the people around you are your cousins. So this is a list of states where first cousin marriage is still legal. And I think that when I said that a minute ago, you probably had some stereotypes about the types of places where that might be happening. And I just want to point out that New Jersey and New York are on that list. So if you want to make your next family reunion super awkward, there you go. So let's talk about traditional American family values. And like I said, we're really thinking about this in terms of pre-industrial America. These are clips from two post-World War II TV shows that really romanticize. And on the right, Happy Days, that was really well after World War II, but still was romanticizing that era. Okay, so these are our worlds where dad is in charge. This on the left is Leave It to Beaver. Like a prototypical dad's in charge. Dad is the law. Dad is the breadwinner. Dad makes all of the decisions. Mom stays home. Mom takes care of the home and the kids. But following that era, television changed, and it really changed how we view the family, and it brought into really stark contrast, like different ways that families functioned and how much conflict there could be, and really just like what the realities of family life were. So the picture on the left is from a show called All in the Family. On the top right is Married with Children, and on the bottom right is Roseanne. All three of these shows had major cultural impacts when they were on TV, because we had only ever seen depictions of the family as being this very happy, lily white, like vanilla cookie cutter world where there weren't really any kind of major disputes happening within the family. Everything is resolved in 22 minutes, and the kids learn a lesson in the end. Here, in this era of television, we're seeing conflict between family members. We're seeing people who are really miserable in their lives. We're seeing really realistic, or at least more realistic, depictions of what working class family life is. And I would say, especially on Roseanne, this show was really groundbreaking at the time. People would criticize it and say that they stole a lot of their ideas from Married with Children. The difference between Married with Children and Roseanne is that Married with Children really relied on being pretty raunchy and like almost kind of like, for the time, like hypersexualized, right? Like a lot of the humor on there is pretty blue, and Roseanne didn't really go into that so much. I mean, there was stuff there that was kind of like that, but there's also storylines on this show. So like the first time I can ever remember seeing something like domestic violence portrayed in a really realistic way was on Roseanne. The first time I can remember seeing alcoholism portrayed in a really realistic way that wasn't meant for like laughs either was also on Roseanne. So that show really is important. And then today, a whole new generation of shows that have really changed how we think about the family and how we portray the family realistically in American television. And I would say that of these three, Modern Family is arguably has had the biggest cultural impact because it was Modern Family that swayed public support for legalizing same-sex marriage because of how that show depicted families. So to say that the family is something that's not affected by other things and that it can't, let's say that there's like a one-size-fits-all definition of the family is really untrue. So earlier in the semester, we also talked about how adolescence was created by the Industrial Revolution. And this is similar to how we think of the family as well. Like this idea of the family and adolescence are really tied together. So I guess like to simplify it, right, we have to think about how the family is one of the main agents of socialization and how we become who we become because of the family environment that we grow up in and all of the different ways that we are like who we are who we are is because of the people that we grow up around, right? So all of our political and religious beliefs, the ideas that we're exposed to are ideas that we're not allowed to be exposed to. Like some parents may be heavily censoring things that their kids are watching. Some of your parents may have told you that there are shows or there's music that you can't listen to. Maybe some of your parents just let you go wild and didn't really censor anything. How we view ourselves as people, how we view ourselves as workers, how we view ourselves as future parents. A lot of that, if not all of it, comes from how we interact with the people that we grow up with. We can also talk about this in terms of like recent changes to how the family is operating, and it's going to be kind of interesting to see how the family further develops given the new economic crisis that we're in as a result of the coronavirus, as the United States appears to be entering into another recession, as really a lot of the more tragic parts of this pandemic start to take effect. But I don't want to talk about that right now. Let's talk about just the family and the economy very broadly. So I can tell you that when I grew up, my dad was the only one of my parents who worked. My mom graduated from high school and she didn't go to college, and she hasn't had like a real job in 40 years. Although she would tell you that she worked harder than my dad and that raising 4 kids was absolutely a job. And she gets really angry when she said, or when people tell her that she never worked, because she absolutely did. But the reality is that today, couples like my parents are increasingly rare because of the reality that if you want to have a middle-class lifestyle, both people are going to have to work. So if you're thinking about getting married and having kids, you one day in the distant future, you're probably going to be in a situation where both you and your partner are working. And that's important because the old way of thinking was that, one of the benefits of that was that it's more natural for moms to be at home anyway, that it's more natural for children to be raised by their mother, that it's better for kids to be raised by one of their parents, but preferably their mother. There's like a your mom joke in there, and I can't really land on it right now, but whatever. Fill it in yourselves. I trust you. So what I'm trying to say is that you're going to be thinking about daycare, right? And once upon a time, daycares or putting your kid into daycare was one of the most looked down upon or like frowned upon things that a parent could do. Like it somehow meant that you failed as a parent if you're paying to have somebody else watch over your kid. We also know that divorce has become much more socially acceptable in the United States. And so that means that in all likelihood, like if we look at the numbers, there's a good chance that some of you are going to end up in those types of blended families where you're going to be a step parent. Your children, your biological children, may also have step parents of their own. You might end up as a single parent one day too. I'm not saying that that's bad in any way, shape, or form, just that is something that has changed in the last like 40, 50 years, just the normalization of divorce. We're not trying to put a value on divorce and say that it's good or bad. It's just a thing that's happening more. The legalization of same-sex marriage has also changed what the family dynamic looks like. What I have highlighted there is the concept of boomerang kids, which some of you might already be experiencing. And you are experiencing that a little bit right now if you're listening to this in isolation with your family. Boomerang kids refers to this relatively new phenomenon in the United States where people will graduate from high school, go off to college, graduate from college, and then end up moving back home with their parents because they don't have the resources yet to buy a house or get married and start their own family. So they'll finish college and then they'll move back home for 6 months to several years while they start working on building up the financial capital that they need to, like I said, buy their own home. That's not how it used to be, right? Back in the day, a high school diploma was all you needed to walk into a factory and get a salary job that is going to pay you enough at 19 years old where you can buy a home, get married, and start having kids. So, a few generations ago, many of you wouldn't be in college right now. You would be working full time. You would be pregnant. You would be raising families right now. And so that's another way to try to capture like how much this stuff has changed, right? Because we can see, like you can think now, how much would your life be different if you had a baby right now? Are you prepared for that? And the reality is that you're not, right? And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just not socially expected of you anymore, like it would have been back in the day. We also know that people are having fewer kids. The birth rate is going down, and people are living a lot longer than they used to be. So this is some data from 2011, just comparing 2011 to 2001 and the number of boomerang kids that were out there. And so you can see an increase. Now this data is almost 10 years old. It's time really to update this slide. So the last thing that I want to talk about, I think, with the family is just the idea of single parents, because of every possible family structure, and I see this a lot, or we see this a lot in student capstones as well, is that single mothers are picked on way, way too much. And it's almost bizarre, right? Because if you think about like the typical child custody kind of battle, the court will oftentimes side with mom. And we'll use that argument that I said a few minutes ago, right? That it's more natural for children to be with their parents, that it's expected. Children don't do good if they're separated from their mother, especially at a young age. And they will really what's the opposite of like vilify single moms? They will really like sing the praises of single moms and will vilify single dads in that situation. Like men are too stupid, men aren't naturally as nurturing, men aren't good parents, which is not true. But then, right after we have said that that mom has to be with their kid, we then turn around and blast single moms for so much delinquency. And this is something that's true now. This is something that's been true since the 1960s. Once the federal government really first started trying to answer the delinquency question, it was single moms that were now suddenly incapable of raising kids by themselves, that single moms could not possibly play both roles, that the fact that there's no father figure around means that boys especially grow up as these almost directionless wild animals, that moms can't discipline, that moms don't have the time for everything, and just over and over, just treating single mothers like they are just short of useless has been really like the MO of a lot of people trying to solve the delinquency problem. And so much so that this mythology, right, that single moms are just the worst parents, that leads to delinquency, has been used in the past as a way, or as an argument rather, against the legalization or like the continuation of divorce. That is hogwash. I so wish that I could be in class with you right now. Like I look forward to this slide so much all semester. And so what you have to understand is that there was a day when I went on Google Images and I searched for hogwash and I found this pig in a laundromat. And it is the best thing that I have ever seen. I just want you to soak it in, much like that pig is soaking it in right now, and just like appreciate and like think about what happened, like the staging of this picture, that they had to get this pig and they had to hoist that big boy up and they had to back him into the washer, soap him up. I mean, obviously they didn't run him through that. This is totally staged. But look at this. This is hogwash. Single mothers are not the enemy. Single mothers are not the devil. Single mothers are not solely responsible for all of the delinquency that's happening in the world. It's absurd. It is such a cop-out. It is such a cheap answer to a very complex problem. And so that is really like, that right there is the last 60, 70 years of delinquency policy in a nutshell, is that the federal government and then people on down the line have still been searching for a very simple solution. And for the government, that simple solution was poverty, and it was single parent households, especially single mothers. So what really is happening in these families? Well, we have to think about how we spend time together. All right. You have to think about how you're spending time with your parents. Is it quantity or is it quality? And so what's happened is that the government and a lot of policymakers, and unfortunately a lot of professors and even students too, think more about this in terms of quantity of time. Okay, so if this was a social control perspective, we would be thinking about this in terms of involvement. That if your parent isn't there all the time, then you are worse off. And if you're a single parent, for whatever reason, divorce, or something else that had led you to that spot, a social control perspective would say that you just can't spend as much time with your kids because you're also working. And if you have more than one kid, then you're having to divide your time potentially between each child. In reality, it's attachment that matters more than involvement. It's not the quantity of time. It is how you spend that time that you do have together. And so if that time spent together is very transactional, or it's I'm going to heat you up a TV dinner and have a beer and fall asleep on the couch, and I'm not going to talk to you about your day or help you with your schoolwork or any problems that you might be having because I'm too tired and I don't want to deal with you, that's not good quality time. But if I am taking that time together, like I said, to help you with your homework, talk to you about your problems, joke around with you, bond with you, all of that like positive parenting stuff, then we're all good. We're going to skip over this one because we talked about that. So, clutching her pearls, I need you to understand that change is inevitable. And we're seeing that especially now as we see how society responds to the coronavirus pandemic. Change is inevitable. Trying to fight change is impossible and it's foolish. I want you to try to remember to be objective as you can. So what this means is that you have to recognize your own preferences as biases and try to interrogate yourself, like, why do I have these preferences and why do I have these biases? And we're not talking about change here with any kind of value on it, right? We're not saying it's good or bad. We're not talking about this in political terms. This is not an election. This is not a change of leadership in the White House. This is not really any of that. This is just change, right? This is change that's happening. Change is going to happen. It's like trying to say that a tornado is evil. A tornado can't be evil. It's just a tornado. It's nature. It's change. And it's scary. And it sometimes can be very violent and sudden. But the tornado itself has no ill will. It has no intent. It's a tornado. Societal change is the same way. It's going to happen. It has to happen. It's always going to happen. There is no scenario that you can think of to create a society where change is not going to happen. So rather than clutch our pearls and wring our hands and cry ourselves to sleep every night about, I can't believe things are changing, I wish they could go back to how they were, like, it's going to happen. And there's nothing that you can do to bring back the old ways. And that's especially relevant now too, right? I wish we could be back in class, but we can't be. I wish that things could go back to the way they were. I wish I appreciated being able to high five people and see all of you and go out into the world and see my parents and everything else, but I can't now. And you can't, some of you either, and it sucks, but we have to deal with it, right? And see how we come out on the other side, how this changes us on the other side, because we're going to be changed, and it's not possible to stop it. So like I said, we have to think about how families function the most. That's our major concern here. We want to think about how parents and kids interact with each other, and we want to think about this in terms of parenting styles. So the book talks about 3 different parenting styles. I think you've probably heard about these before, either in Social 101 or potentially Psych 101. So I'm not going to go over this too much. We know that there are authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative parents. Really, this is just a spectrum of permissiveness, right? So people who are extremely authoritarian, that means that they're demanding total obedience from their kids, that what they say goes. Their children are not allowed to question anything. Really, children are to be seen and not heard. On the opposite end of that, being permissive means that you are giving your kids a lot of freedom. You're very rarely saying no to them. You are doing a lot to try to cultivate them. So that means that you are signing them up for a lot of like extracurricular or after school types of programs. But it's really giving your children a lot of autonomy. And then somewhere in the middle, this idea of authoritative parents, really pushing for like positive reinforcement. Kids here have some autonomy, but there is still some discipline. So it's kind of, I don't want to say it's like right in the middle, and I don't want to say it's like cherry picking to like the best of both ends. It's tough to describe. I would say maybe more like a triangle, like 3 points on a triangle might make more sense for this. What is really interesting, though, is when we get into how we can think about delinquency as a result of family interactions and how different family structures, or I'm sorry, how different family styles can have can influence the likelihood of being delinquent. So the first one that I have up here on the screen is this idea of power control theory, an idea developed by a criminologist named John Hagen. So power control theory is all about the power balance within a household. And what Hagen argues is that in families that are more traditional, meaning families that try to reflect that traditional American family values, like the whole nuclear parent, father knows best kind of world, those families, the children in those families, if they're boys, they're more likely to be delinquent than their girls are. So sons in those families are very delinquent, girls less so. In families that are more egalitarian, meaning that mom and dad share responsibility for work and mom and dad share responsibility around the house, we see a decrease in the delinquency among boys and an increase in delinquency among girls. And I'm gesturing with my hands right now, which is ridiculous, but that's where we're at. And so what this means is that in these more traditional households where dad has all of the power and mom has very little power, their children are very perceptive and they see that this is happening. And boys will see that, well, dad's a boy and dad gets to do whatever he wants to do. So I'm a boy. I also get to do whatever I want to do. And if that means breaking the rules, then so what? I'm a boy. I can do that. Where girls in that environment see mom as this permissive or submissive creature and are socialized to think of themselves in that same way. On the flip side, if you think about egalitarian families where both parents have economic responsibilities and child rearing responsibilities, and the level of delinquency drops for boys and raises for girls, it kind of balances out, right? Because both boys and girls see their parents as partially autonomous or independent. Like they have to go out, they have to take risks and stuff in their own jobs, but they're also reliant on each other and they also depend on each other. So that's why we don't see this massive increase in delinquency for girls and boys not dropping off, because boys are now seeing their fathers having to be kind of, I don't want to say submissive, but have to delay gratification themselves on things. We also have to think about this, about like some of this, the general theory of crime stuff, right? And how self-control and discipline plays a part in here. So reality is that one of the most important things as a inhibitor for delinquency is parents caring. Parents who care, that no matter what reduces the risk of delinquency. So like it comes up a lot in student capstones, so students will oftentimes advocate for parenting education classes and teaching people, especially first-time parents, like how to parent. And that's not really the solution. Like what you have to think about isn't the involvement, it's the attachment. So you have to think about ways to make people care about their kids. Okay. And that's a lot tougher. You can't learn to care from a parenting class. All right. You have to, how do you learn to care about your kids? You're supposed to, but obviously not everybody does. We also then have to think about like the time question here. So if you're looking for policy ideas, just theoretically, if that's you, I would think about things that take parents away from their kids and might prevent them from really developing these caring and nurturing relationships. So that could be part of it, right? We could see a child care factor, an employment factor there, something to consider. It's also entirely possible that parents see bad behavior that their kids are involved in and don't consider it bad. Like there are things that your parents. So I'll use myself as an example. I know my kids are going to get in trouble one day, and I know that I'm going to be going into the school and fighting with the principal or the vice principal or the SRO or whoever about what dumb rule my kids have been accused of breaking, and saying that like this is a stupid rule and like not taking the school side. If this was something that was effective, right? And we tend to think of like the law is something that everybody agrees with, then I and the school would be on the same page. But there are lots of instances where there is a disconnect and where we can't expect parents to look at behaviors that their kids are involved in or their kids are doing and just have them, or just like expect them to conclude that that's bad behavior. Not everybody is going to see it as bad behavior. There's also the issue of gender stereotypes, and this ties into some of the labeling stuff we talked about in the previous set of lectures. Parents may buy into gender stereotypes. Parents may play favorites. I think we talked about in this class how discipline changes over time. So if you are the oldest, your parents were probably terrified that anything was going to break you, and that the more children they had, the more experience they had as parents, the more they realized that children, especially small children, really bounce back from everything. They also may have softened in their disciplinary styles too, right? So as the oldest child, the first one going through middle school and high school, you probably had a very strict curfew, parents breathing down your neck all the time about who you're hanging out with. But if you've got younger siblings, especially if you have a big family and you've got like 3 or 4 or 5 siblings, like your youngest sibling is made in the shade, man. Like mom and dad they care, but not a ton about where you are. And so you have younger siblings who can get away with a ton more, just because of that experience factor from parents. And so again, this matters because we think of and we define discipline as this constant, right? We think of the law as a constant thing. But all the time, families do not discipline their kids consistently, and they don't discipline their kids the same way over time. Okay, so imagine like a courtroom, and it's the first case of the day at 9 a.m. and it's a kid has been arrested for robbery, and the judge throws the book at him. But by the end of the day, and the judge has seen, a dozen more cases, and it's another robbery trial, another robbery case at 4:00, and the judge is like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. like we would be furious, and we would remove that judge or have that judge voted out of office, right? Like that's not how discipline is supposed to work. That's not how punishment is supposed to work. But all the time, realistically, that's how families discipline their kids. Discipline is not this constant, concrete thing. It can't be. It's unrealistic to expect it to be. We also have to think about this in terms of family violence. And we have a tendency, and I think this might be a reason why family violence is not something that is taken as seriously as maybe it should be, because we have this tendency to think of the family as a universally good thing. And in reality, like the family is not. And we know this, again, like I hate to keep bringing it up, but the elephant in the room. We know this with the coronavirus, right? And everybody who is now under quarantine, that there's going to be a spike in child abuse and a spike in domestic violence, because of people being stuck, in some cases, in very close captivity to each other, for a very long period of time. We know that, especially for girls, there is this specter of risk hanging over your lives from childhood through adulthood. Approximately 1 in 4 girls victims of sexual abuse. Approximately 1 in 4 women in college victims of attempted and completed rape. Approximately 1 in 4 women victims of domestic violence or relationship violence in adulthood. And that's like an approximation. It could very well be much more than that, depending on how we define violence. And so we can't have that idea. So I'll put it like this, like it's intellectually inconsistent to say that the family is a universally great thing, and then also say that 25% of women are victimized in a family setting. You know what I mean? And don't tell me that, like, don't use the bad apple analogy, because like people always misuse the bad apple analogy. If this only means that 75% of families are okay, I would argue that that's a pretty major problem. We also have to think about this in terms of like the intergenerational transmission of values, and how family violence is something that is replicated from one generation to the next. So the way that this works is that if I am a child who was abused, right, physically, emotionally, even sexually, and I go through that and I survive that, and then I go on to have kids of myself, I'm probably more likely to engage in those types of behaviors not because it's something that is biological, but because I learned that, right? And when I'm in a stressful situation dealing with my kid and I'm not sure what to do, my fallback, consciously or subconsciously, is to think about, okay, well, what did my parents do when they were in this situation? If my parents' solution to this problem, whatever it is to be abusive, then I might be more likely to be abusive, right? We also know that families can pass on all kinds of bad habits to their kids. How many of you learn to drink from a family member? Like, we can't look at alcoholism as this healthy and beloved activity. It's not, right? How many of you have been really intentional with your own substance use, either in high school or in college now, because you've seen family members who have struggled with substance use problems? That's something that you've picked up, right? And if you weren't intentional about it, like if you didn't sit down and really think about what was going on in your family and how that may be something that you could yourself be doing, like you may be falling into a bad pattern, right? Which could then hurt your own kids. So the last couple of things that I want to talk about today, and I think we'll stop it here because I've talked a lot more than I wanted to. Let's talk about the gender ratio and the generalizability problems. So there are two consistencies with all of the theories that we have covered in the class. The first is that no matter what, that theory was only designed to explain the behavior of boys. And we know that across the board, across time, across culture, that more boys are involved in delinquency than girls. That doesn't mean that only boys are delinquent, just that more boys than girls are offending. And so I don't have an answer for you about either one of those problems. The second one is called the gender ratio problem, that boys are offending more than girls. We don't really have an explanation why. Feminist criminology does. Feminist criminology would say that it's all in how we socialize boys. And I think that that is really largely true, but I don't know if that explains everything. I'm not sure. I think we'd also have to consider like the laws and status offenses and stuff like that. And so all of that is to say that there is a conflict explanation for the gender ratio problem, but I'm not sure how powerful that explanation is. I think it's pretty powerful, but not all the way there. The generalizability problem, like I said, is the fact that overwhelmingly every theory we've covered in here either treats boys and girls as being the same, or it just excluded girls altogether, and the theorist had an attitude of, well, who cares about girls? Like, why should we care about the offending behaviors of girls? Which is pretty sexist and pretty brutal, right? And so where that leaves us is having to, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We don't want to say, well, the theory is completely useless because it didn't include girls. What we want to do is say, okay, well, here's the idea that Hershey or Agnew or whomever had about why delinquency happens. And we understand that they are writing mostly about boys. So how do girls experience this theoretical process differently? So are boys and girls affected by social control the same way? Are boys and girls, do they experience the same types of stress? Do boys and girls experience labeling the same way? And the answer is, to all of those, yes and no. Like, you're going to see similarities and you're going to see very stark differences. And that's why this stuff is important, right? If we're thinking about this as a policy and we want to develop a nuanced but pragmatic policy that reflects how complex juvenile delinquency is and the causes of delinquency are, we cannot do something that is a one-size-fits-all thing. And this is an example of how the law is so slow to adapt to the realities of society, and how we think of the law is really, in a lot of ways, outdated and outmoded. again, thinking about like politics and justice, the legal system is very political. And this idea that there has to be one law for everybody is in itself a political decision, right? Especially when you think about like, even in practice, that's not how it works. So in other words, what I'm saying is that if we really want to create legal systems that can reduce or eliminate delinquency, there has to be space in there to say that boys and girls experience these things differently than each other. Not that there needs to be 2 sets of rules. I would argue like 50 sets of rules, really. The other thing about this, kind of related to the generalizability problem as it regards gender, are issues of race and social class. We have focused so much of our policy attention on poverty and on blackness, especially, with theories that don't necessarily always apply there, right? So in other words, if it makes sense that boys and girls experience things differently because of their gender, why couldn't it also be true that white kids and black kids and brown kids don't also experience the world differently because of their race or their ethnic background? Which is also interesting now too, because we see whiteness really taking some blows, right? There are people on the right who are offering explanations of the coronavirus that blame Italians and say there's something genetically different about Italians, which is incredibly stupid. But dumb people are going to say dumb things. I don't know what to tell you. These theories have also really focused only on poor people, on poor kids. So how can you take theories that are designed to explain the criminal behavior or the delinquent behavior of poor kids and apply that to rich kids? Because rich kids are out there doing some bad stuff too, man. And I don't know that their social class necessarily fits into some of the ideas we've been talking about in here. So there's a whole other world right there about like the delinquent behavior of rich kids and why they're doing it. Is it because they want to flaunt the law? Is it because it's just a hobby? Like there's lots of things going on there that we need to talk about. So we've covered this stuff, gender differences and different theories. So I'm going to stop it there for today. I hope you are all doing well. I want you all to be safe and be smart, and I will talk to you soon. Hey, let me know if there's anything I can do for you, okay? Be well.